Hi, and welcome to the Right to Remain Silent podcast. I'm Jim Weber, your host and guide through actual accounts of intriguing and fascinating true crime stories as told by the law enforcement professional that experienced the event. The Right to Remain Silent podcast makes no exaggeration of fact, doesn't glamorize details, or sensationalize reality. The format here is basic. Real stories from real cops. Lastly, please don't forget to like, follow, subscribe, and share. Doing this will help me continue to provide you, the listener, with captivating and relevant true crime stories. Now, let's listen in on today's episode. Hi, and welcome to today's episode of the Right to Remain Silent podcast. I'm your host, Jim Weber. Today, we are at the Missouri State Highway Patrol Troop F headquarters in Jefferson City, Missouri. They've been kind enough to allow us to record our episode here, and you may hear in the background some construction noise. So don't think it's you. It might be the background noise here while they're doing the construction. Our guest today is Assistant Missouri Attorney General Kevin Zoellner. Kevin, thanks for being here.
Jim, thanks for having me. And I also want to, on behalf of the Graham family, thank you. I know when I broached this subject with them about doing this podcast, that they were very enthusiastic about having this story told. I'm sure they're grateful for it.
Yep, I'm proud to be involved in this and happy to share this story. I think it's one of great importance. The topic today, like you mentioned, is the 2005 murder of Missouri State Highway Patrol Sergeant Carl Dewayne Graham. Every law enforcement death is a tragedy. In some cases, we can at least understand the circumstances. A trooper struck by a vehicle during a traffic stop, for example, is a heartbreaking loss that occurred in the line of duty. But the murder of Sergeant Graham was not a tragic accident in the line of duty. It was a premeditated and brutal execution. Kevin, do you remember a conversation that you would have had with Colonel Stottlemyre about this?
I do, Jim. Colonel Stottlemyre was the colonel at the time that Sergeant Graham was murdered. He later left to be the director of the Gaming Commission, and while he was colonel and while he was at the Gaming Commission, he would call and we would go and talk. I also talked to him preparing for the trial, and I had a conversation with him early on, though, as a non-law enforcement officer. I was, in my mind, this murder, the manner in which it happened, somehow different than what law enforcement officers sometimes tend, especially highway patrolmen, may lose their life in. And Colonel Stottlemyre, during one of those conversations, I broached that subject with him because I didn't want to offend anyone by thinking of this murder being a little different. Colonel Stottlemyre told me that Sergeant Graham's murder was different. He described how it's almost not that they want it to happen, but an accepted part of their job that they anticipate there's the danger of maybe being on the side of the highway, getting hit by a car, dealing with a domestic situation where it's gone bad. But in this situation, Sergeant Graham was killed. He was assassinated in his driveway after he got off work. I remember when Colonel Stottlemyre was discussing this with me, he discussed, or I think the statement he made was, "This one hits somehow different, Kevin." Always
remember that. Yeah, and listeners are gonna hear the details of that, and I believe they'll find it shocking what happened in this incident here. Like you said, Sergeant Graham was stalked and ambushed at his home wearing his uniform beside his state patrol vehicle after his shift, and he was targeted in a deliberate attack, and you used the appropriate word. He was assassinated. Um, for the listeners today, Kevin is the prosecutor that led the fight for justice in this murder of Sergeant Carl Graham. He took the case to trial, he secured a conviction, and he saw it through to the sentencing, which was the death sentence for the individual. And we're going to talk about all those phases as we progress through. He's going to walk us through the investigation, he's going to walk us through the courtroom battle, and how justice was ultimately served. And I just want to, again, Kevin, thank you for taking the time to be here today to discuss it. Before we get into the conversation, for the purpose of the viewers knowing your background and where you're coming from on our discussion today, could you start out by just telling us a bit about yourself? What led you to become an attorney, specifically a prosecutor? Maybe you could walk us through your background a little bit.
Well, I never grew up intending to be a lawyer. When I got out of high school, my hope was to be a carpenter, cabinet maker to be specific, and was looking into that. But I had had two major knee surgeries from sports, having ligaments replaced in the knee. And I remember a conversation I had with my knee surgeon. He said that, when you get to be 35 or 40, you're going to feel about 60, 65. And maybe I ought to look into getting some sort of education and different type of job. And I wound up going to college, wound up getting interested in economics, and that's what I majored in. But that's somewhat of the Amway degree. You can teach it to others. And talking to one of my professors, she suggested that I look into being a lawyer because of the logic involved in the economy and studying the economy. Might be interested in the law. And I began doing so. And in doing so, I right away decided I didn't think I'd like being on the civil side of things, and that was later confirmed for me with a brief stint in private practice. But I did go to law school, and I graduated, and I started out in Cape Girardeau County as an assistant prosecuting attorney and worked there for about 3.5 years, almost 4 years. I went into private practice then for about 2 years with some good friends of mine, and I learned, as I said earlier, that private practice wasn't for me, and I wound up getting on with the Missouri Attorney General's office. And what they were starting up at that time was a meth prosecution strike force. And in that unit, I basically began handling some meth cases, but also homicides. And probably within a year or two was working on capital murders throughout the state on pretty much a full-time basis. And that's what I've done until recently, about 2 years ago. 3 years ago, the Attorney General started a cold case unit, and they asked me to lead that unit looking into cold cases.
How many years has it been that you've been with the Missouri Attorney General's office?
I believe this coming July will be 29.
Okay. All right. So essentially your entire career, you've dealt with prosecutions, like you said, from the prosecutorial aspect of it here, and you've seen many different shocking cases with incredible details. And you and I both know from our experience in our careers that the harsh truth is that evil does exist in the world, and while some tragedies are heartbreaking, they can be understood as part of those inherent risk of law enforcement, like we've mentioned. And this case kind of stands apart from that. But as we sit here, behind us is the memorial wall honoring the Missouri State Highway Patrol troopers that gave their lives in the line of duty, each one essentially a hero who made the ultimate sacrifice protecting you and me. Let's talk a little bit more specifically about that. In the year 2005, that year was especially painful and difficult for the Highway Patrol because 4 different troopers lost their lives in the line of duty. And tragically, 2 of those occurred within just 1 month of each other. And since we're going to be talking about Sergeant Carl Dewayne Graham today, uh, who died in 2005, I'd also like to mention the other troopers that passed in the year 2005 and that are displayed on the wall here. As I said, Trooper Carl Dewayne Graham, March 20th of 2005. Trooper Ralph Tatoyan, who passed away on April 20th of 2005. Trooper John Sampietro, also known as J. Sampietro, August 17th of 2005. And Trooper Donald K. Floyd, who passed in September 22nd of 2005. I think it's important to honor these individuals as we sit here and discuss this specific case involving Sergeant Graham. This story that we're going to dive into today has a defendant, an individual responsible for this senseless death. And to properly tell this story, we have to address him. But the goal of this conversation today is to highlight Sergeant Graham and his life and his contributions to law enforcement and to society. I think it's important to mention that. And I'd like to turn to you, Kevin, and ask, based off your involvement in this case, in this investigation and prosecution of the individual, can you describe Sergeant Graham, what you learned about him, the type of person he was? Tell us a little bit about him.
Over those years of working in law as a prosecutor, I've met numerous members of the Highway Patrol. I did not know Sergeant Graham, had not met him, but I knew a lot of men and women that were just like him. But I did get to know him through his family and his friends and his fellow troopers. He was 37. He and his former wife shared a son, Hayden. Hayden was 4 at the time of his death. Hayden was where Sergeant Graham was going to that night after he got off work to spend some time with him. Sergeant Graham loved being, from what I saw, loved being a highway patrolman. He hunted, fished, did all the types of things that a lot of people in southern Missouri do. And he was thought very highly of. And his family, who I've gotten to know, unfortunately, through these circumstances and kept in touch with over the years, were very close to him and tragically harmed by this incident.
How about, you mentioned southern Missouri and where Sergeant Graham worked. Could you, for familiars that aren't, or for listeners that aren't familiar with this case, could you maybe share a little bit about that region of the state here in Missouri where this murder occurred? Maybe give us a description. Was it a big city? Was it a small city? Was it rural? What type of industry did they have there?
The murder happened in Carter County. Carter County, the county seat, is a small town called Van Buren. It's very rural. If you know where the Boot Heel is in Missouri, kind of on the edge of that Boot Heel is a town, probably the biggest town is Poplar Bluff. Van Buren is about 60 miles, 40 to 60 miles west of Poplar Bluff. But it's a very rural community. I think at the time of the homicide, the population was about 5,000 people. The two major industries, if you will, one was timber, the other one was a tourist industry. And it wasn't one based upon all-inclusive resorts like in Mexico or the Caribbean. It was a floating industry. There's quite a bit of floating down on some of the rivers down in that area. It was a town like a lot in Missouri and other states where I think a lot of kids grow up and have wonderful childhoods, but they go on to other counties and other locations to work. It's a county that is, like many, aging. Population is aging.
Sure, that gives us a good snapshot of that region that we're going to talk about here today. the person convicted of murdering Sergeant Graham is Lance Shockley. That's the individual that you prosecuted. Can you tell us a little bit about Lance Shockley, what you learned throughout the course of your involvement in this investigation, this prosecution? Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, Lance was 28 at the time he killed Sergeant Graham. He was married to Corey Shockley and had had two young girls with a woman by the name of Laura Smith. I can't remember if he and Laura were actually married or lived together. And they remained close because of the girls. Lance worked as a carpenter. My understanding is in that area, there is a national forest, the Mark Twain Forest, and some of the landowners had land taken through eminent domain by the federal government, and that always didn't sit well with everybody down there. And that was sort of a theory of why Lance harbored such a resentment to law enforcement that obviously we'll talk about with respect to Sergeant Graham, but there were other incidents that we learned about that shows his bitter feelings towards men in law enforcement.
Okay, yeah, and we're definitely going to get into those incidents. At some point, Sergeant Graham and Shockley, their lives intersect, and they become acquainted with one another based off of an incident. I think it was November 26th of 2004. There was an accident. There was a leaving the scene of an accident, and there was a death that occurred in that accident. And it occurred in the zone or the area that Sergeant Graham worked, and it involved Lance Shockley. Could you just kind of tell us how Sergeant Graham and Shockley began or they intersected based off that incident?
Well, and to get perspective, the murder of Sergeant Graham happened on March 24th, March 20th of 2005. This weekend you're talking about, November 26th of 2004, was Thanksgiving weekend. I believe Sergeant Graham and Lance had crossed paths very briefly, I think we'll talk about later, on a prior incident that Sergeant Graham just was transporting Lance Shockley to jail that somebody else had arrested him for. But on this November date, it was Thanksgiving weekend, Cindy Chilton was down visiting her sister, Corey Shockley. I think they were staying together out there at Corey and Lance's home. She had with her her fiance at the time, a fellow named Jeff Bayless. And on that Thanksgiving weekend, at some point, I think Lance and Jeff decided to go out drinking in his truck on the rural roads, probably spotlighting deers, and they were driving at a high rate of speed. Friends of Lance's, Paul and Ivy Napier, lived out in that area, and they recall hearing a truck speed by at a very high rate of speed. And then about 10 or 15 minutes later, they had a knock on the door. It was Lance. Lance had gone off into a ditch, injuring himself in the back of the head, not too badly, but he bled, and killing Jeff Bayless. Lance went to their home to ask them to help him basically get away with the crime. They called Corey, and Paul then drove Lance to a location where Corey and Cindy picked up Lance. Paul went home, and with instructions then after that they were coming back to where this death of Jeff Bayless had happened in this accident. After Corey, Cindy, and Lance visited that area briefly so that Lance could tell them what happened, they left and went back to Lance and Corey's house, and Paul and Ivy then were instructed to call law enforcement and report this crash, which they did. On that night, then, Sergeant Graham came out to investigate that crime scene. And he found Jeff Bayless alone in that car, dead, and he found a blood smudge, if you will, on the back bumper. As the truck lay there in that area, it looked like somebody may have gotten out of the vehicle and had blood on their hand as they leaned on that bumper, kind of trying to look down at the wreck. And Sergeant Graham took a blood sample, what we call a buccal swab, of that blood so that it could be tested to determine whose it was. He then, after talking with Paul and Ivy Napier, went to Lance's home where he had learned that Cindy Chilton would be so that he could make the death notification. Lance met Sergeant Graham, I think, on the porch. He had showered and cleaned up and was wearing a hat to cover up this cut or abrasion that Cindy later told us was on the back of his head. And Sergeant Graham made those notifications, told them he would do whatever he could for them, and left behind his card, his business card, which after he left, Lance went in the house and tore that business card up. The investigation from that point on really unfortunately didn't go anywhere. That buccal swab was sent up to the Missouri State Highway Patrol lab to be tested, but given the amount of backlog unfortunately our labs have, it wasn't, and given the nature of this case, it wasn't going to get tested promptly. And so basically, the case, that leaving the scene of an accident, negligent homicide or involuntary manslaughter case, kind of went stagnant. Later on, in March of 2005, Sergeant Graham kind of knew, I think had figured out what had happened, and he decided to start the investigation again, even without the answer from the buccal swab. And he decided he was going to go talk to Cindy and talk to her. And she, unfortunately, I believe this started on March 19th, the day before the murder. He went to where Cindy was staying, saw Mark Keeney, her stepfather, and learned she was out of town. But Mark now knew Sergeant Graham was looking into this case again. Sergeant Graham decided he wanted to speak to the Napiers, Paul and Ivy Napier, and went to that residence. Paul was at work, but he spoke to Ivy and asked Ivy, or basically told her a white lie, an investigative technique, told her that he had just spoken to Lance. Lance had told him what really happened and that she wasn't in any trouble, but she needed to tell the truth. And she proceeded to do so. She told him basically what had happened that night. Hearing the truck speed by, the crash, he arriving with a little bit of blood, and how she and her husband Paul helped get him back home and then called law enforcement. Sergeant Graham left, and when he left, Ivy got in touch with Lance, and they had a phone conversation. And Ivy basically said, "Hey, I'm sorry, I went ahead and told him the truth." And Lance is like, "Well, what do you mean you told him the truth?" And she said, "Well, Sergeant Graham was here and told me he had already spoke to you and that you had already told him what had happened and confessed. And so I went ahead and told him." And Lance got a little mad, and because he had not spoken to Sergeant Graham, he had not confessed. And Ivy apologized, and he said that that was okay. It would all be okay. So he went back home. Sergeant Graham presumably finished his shift on that Saturday and went home himself. Sunday morning, March 20th, Sergeant Graham was going to be on duty again, and Cindy Chilton's stepfather, Mark Keeney, must have seen him about town somewhere. Cindy and Corey went shopping in Poplar Bluff, a nearby town. Mark was at home when Lance showed up. Lance told Mark Keeney that he was going to take care of this problem with Sergeant Graham that day and wanted to know if he had seen him. Mark told him, "Yeah, I seen him around town. He was working." And Lance asked, "Well, where does he live?" Mark Keeney told him, "Hey, he lives up at the old Treadway residence. There's a small home up off of Route M in Carter County that I guess Mr. Treadway, a lot of people knew it was his residence. There's a story there, but they all kind of knew whose residence that was. And Lance left saying, I'm going to take care of this today. He then proceeded home. He went first, to his Uncle Robert's house, who lived out in the rural part of the country, and asked Robert to borrow his truck. And Uncle Robert said, no, you're not going to borrow it. Basically, Lance kind of drove like a daredevil, and he didn't want to get his truck wrecked. So Lance went back home, talked to Sylvan Duncan about moving some brush or some timber with the bulldozer later that day, around 1. And then eventually he went to his grandmother's house out in that area and asked to borrow her car, which was a red Pontiac Grand Am. And it also had one of those back during this time, the Gulf War was going. A lot of people had those yellow ribbons, magnetic decals on the back of her car. And so Lance borrowed her car. Sergeant Graham, working his shift, would have gotten off at 4 p.m. He would have pulled into his driveway. If you can picture his house, Route M would have ran north and south just a little bit east of his residence. And it would have ran from up the hill, south being downhill, north being uphill. And there was a small road that ran perpendicular to M to his house and then further down that hill. Sergeant Graham pulled into his driveway, backed in, and went what they call the 1042. He signed off at 4:03 that afternoon. His plans were to go see his son. He got out of his vehicle and went to the back seat to either put something away or get something out. And we later found his notes on the interviews he wanted to conduct with Cindy Shilton laying there. And as he got to his back of his vehicle, he stood up. He was shot one time with a high-powered rifle. That shot severed his spine, immediately paralyzing him and causing him to fall to the ground. He was on a concrete path, and he fell so hard that his skull fractured. And for all intents and purposes, from speaking with the pathologist, he was either dead or dying at that point in time. He wasn't going to recover. While Sergeant Graham laid there, Lance Shockley kind of plotted his next move. And the problem for Lance was when he came out there, he didn't know how he would commit this crime. He brought with him, Lance had lots and lots of guns. He brought with him a high-powered rifle, .243 caliber, Browning lever action, and it had a scope. He also brought with him a shotgun, and I'm convinced he probably had a handgun on him also. He parked his grandmother's car, if you remember Route M running north and south of Sergeant Graham's home, to the east of that home. There was another street that ran further east, kind of parallel to M, and he parked that vehicle on that road. And that road was later seen by a couple of different neighbors passing by it before and after during the relevant times. It was identified by that being a red car with some type of yellow softball-sized sticker. But he parked that car there and came over to the Graham residence trying to figure out how to do this. And that carport pad where Sergeant Graham was shot by that high-powered rifle was elevated. What I mean by that, it was at the top of the hill by the house. The ground fell away. And 30 or 40 feet below that was a storage building, a shed that had a retaining wall made of, a chest-high retaining wall made of railroad ties. And the officers ultimately found on that railroad tie that this was using ballistic analysis, trajectory analysis, that's where that first shot would have came from. But on that railroad tie was also a splinter, as if somebody had rested a weapon on that, pulled a piece of that railroad tie off that was found laying, that little splinter was found laying in the hay or straw grass right there. And it was fresh. You could tell from when it broke apart that it would have been fresh. So we believe we don't believe, we know Sergeant Graham was standing up above. Lance would have been hiding below, behind this retaining wall, with a perfect firing position. The problem is when Sergeant Graham went down so quickly, I'm guessing Lance did not know whether he was dead for certain or what had happened or whether he sought cover, what. And he waited about 5, maybe 10 minutes to approach up that hill. And we know that because further down the hill, there were some folks getting ready to travel out of town. They were employed to paint these big towers we have. And that Sunday evening, they were gathering up their gear to get out of town. And what they reported, and lots of people in that area reported, hearing gunshots, which isn't unusual in that rural part of the world. But what everybody was consistent in reporting was some kind of high-powered rifle firing once, and then a pause of 5 to 10 minutes, and then 2 quick shots in succession, either from a handgun or shot type of weapon. So what we know happened to Sergeant Graham is while he laid on his back on that concrete dying, Lance crept up on him on that hill. And when he would have gotten to basically Lance's chest being level with Sergeant Graham's head as he laid there, Lance used his shotgun to basically pump 2 shots into Sergeant Graham's face. I think he then ran through those yards back over to his house and returned that vehicle to his grandmother.
Let me stop you there and ask you. So Shockley is essentially laying in wait at Sergeant Graham's residence, just waiting, clearly armed with multiple weapons, and fires that shot, as you described, creeps up on him. And this is very graphic, but he puts 2 shots into the head or face of Sergeant Graham. And you and I have talked multiple times before meeting today to discuss this case. How would you categorize, or what would you call those final 2 shots that Shockley delivered?
Well, I call them fuck you shots. Excuse my language, but that's what I call them. Lance would have known that Sergeant Graham was dead or dying. He wasn't going to be moving. And you add to that factor what I now know about Lance's behavior with law enforcement over some pretty petty matters and some previous serious statements he would have made, that he had no respect for law enforcement. And now Sergeant Graham is messing with his life over, even though it was a tragic death of Jeff Bayless, pretty minor incident in our criminal justice system. He wasn't going to allow it. I believe he pumped those 2 rounds into him to send a message.
And then on top of that, you describe, he runs away. He flees. He runs away from the act that he just committed. And that, I think, speaks, as we're going to discuss further, to the character of Shockley and his, like you said, his behavior and his viewpoint or his stance on law enforcement in general. So let's go back to pick up where you left off. He flees the area. He's in that red car, and he goes where?
He goes to his grandmother's house. Amelia Mae Shockley was his grandmother, an older lady. She was I would call her a very God-fearing woman, and she did not want to lie for him during this. We can talk about that a little bit later, but he basically went to her house on that occasion and returned those keys to her, not telling her where he'd been or basically what he had been doing. He went to his home, and he and Corey, I believe, proceeded to get rid of the murder weapon and other signs of any activity involving 243 caliber weapons. Law enforcement ultimately found when they searched Lance Shockley's house all kinds of weapons, and they were actually lined up around windows and what I would call a fallback position if he was going to fight it out with the cops, which he told some people he would do, back into a closet where he had guns hidden in the closet and under in a dirty clothes basket. He was known to have had two 243s in his life. The one we believe he used, the 243 I described, that was a lever action. It had a gold-plated trigger and a scope on it. He had referred to as his baby at various times, and lots of people had seen it. He always had it with him. He also had an old beat-up 243 that his father had given him that meant something to him. My understanding, his father had died a tragic death when a truck carrying timber rolled over and crushed him, or there was a fire, and his father died in that accident. But he had this other 243. And we also know that he shot a lot out there at his place, and with his Uncle Robert, he bought ammunition together in bulk. But Uncle Robert shot 223 and only 223, whereas Lance shot 243. And that's significant later on, too. But that at the time, he was known to have these guns and had all these other guns. Missing from the house, missing from anywhere he had locations when he was searched everywhere, was both of these 243s, and they have never been recovered.
Well, let's talk about that. You have Sergeant Graham executed in his driveway. You have Shockley fleeing the scene, disposing of evidence. At what point does that investigation begin of that murder? And walk us through, as you were, walk us through that investigation, how it unfolded.
Well, that night, obviously, the Highway Patrol massed numerous investigators. They set up a command post in the Department of Transportation building right there down the road from where the murder happened. And other agencies became involved and lent whatever support and services they could. And the Highway Patrol began investigating a lot of different people, including anybody that may have had a grudge against Sergeant Graham. They went to his disciplinary file, and if somebody had filed a complaint because he was rude to them on the road or something, that person got investigated. And there was a prime suspect at the time, an individual who used to work for the Missouri State Water Patrol, who Sergeant Graham had busted for possessing methamphetamine. And he was flushed out of the Water Patrol and prosecuted for those crimes. And at the time, he initially was one of the suspects that they were very, very much concerned about. And in fact, when one of the officers, Jeff Heath, went to interview Lance Shockley the night of the murder, he thought he was running down just a non-starter in terms of a lead. Mm-hmm. He thought this other guy was going to be the one where the evidence would lead at that point in time.
Okay. And you talked about the multiple weapons, and you described the two rifles that he had. And he said something that was very interesting about all these weapons, additional weapons that he had within his residence lined up. I think you said a fallback line. For listeners that aren't really familiar with that terminology, what do you think that indicated in the Shockley residence and maybe his thought process?
Well, again, from a conversation I guess we'll get into in a little bit, he had told an incident happened that night involving a shooting with law enforcement. But in his house, which was a very nice cabin, a log cabin out there, around the doorways and windows, guns had been stacked outside of their gun cases and gun cabinets. And it looked like he was prepared to defend any position from in that house if law enforcement came from him. Now, this is a couple days down the road where they go out there and search that residence and find this. But it looks like also there's a trail of guns leading to this walk-in closet off the bedroom. That if he has to fight it out, eventually he's going to work his way back there as his Alamo, if you will. And he had stored and placed some guns there for that purpose.
Sure. Okay. So as the patrol, this is something all homicide investigations are taken very seriously, and great efforts are put into them to get to the bottom of what happened here. But when such a heinous crime occurs to a fellow law enforcement officer, the troopers roll up their sleeves and they work 24/7. And that's what happened here. And there were a couple, troopers involved in this, Trooper Heath and Trooper Mills, that had interactions with Shockley as this investigation unfolded. Could you tell us about a couple key incidents or conversations that these specific troopers or others would have had with number one, with Shockley himself, and number two, with any other key witnesses, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, I'll walk you through those conversations. Sure. Now, first of all, too, I mentioned that the 243s were missing. This was a highly circumstantial evidence case. What happened also that afternoon of the murder, while he and Corey are getting rid of those guns, and I add Corey into this because of what I'm about to tell you, she shows up at Uncle Robert's house with a box of ammunition, 243 caliber. Lance had called Robert and said, hey, Corey's coming out. She needs to borrow some cigarettes. Her real purpose was, I think they knew things were going on. The police were descending on the town. People were getting interviewed, and they had cleaned their house out because there was no 243 weapons or ammunition found in their house. But I think they missed a box. And so that evening, Corey hurried over to Uncle Robert's house to give him that ammunition. Her fingerprint was ultimately found on that box, and Uncle Robert told us that she brought it to him and said, Lance wants you to have this. And Uncle Robert said, well, why? That boy knows I don't shoot that. But he took that, and that box of ammunition was ultimately found at his house. Later that evening, Lance, again, I mentioned earlier, he was a carpenter, did construction. He was, I think, working in a town called Malden, which was a little bit of ways, and would have had to have gotten up relatively early to go to work. Jeff Heath and Terry Mills are the two troopers that extensively interviewed Lance over the course of the next couple days. And they called out there that night. It was about 10 o'clock, and they asked if they could come to the house and speak with him. Well, they were right up the road, basically, when they placed this call. And before placing the call, they had actually gotten the Sykeston Department of Public Safety CERT team or SWAT team out there. They were concerned it was at night, Lance is a suspect, and with all the things he had done in the past with law enforcement, and that a trooper had been killed, they were a little concerned about being out there at night without some sort of backup. So they placed the call, and Lance tells them, hey, I got to go to work. I don't have time for you guys. I'll talk to you later. And hangs up. And as they sit there just up the road, they see Lance come out and start looking around on the porch, which the troopers then proceed to drive down there and talk to him a little bit. They talk outside. They explain why they're there, ask if he has a few minutes. He doesn't have time for that. He's got to be at work. He needs to get to bed early. Says, maybe I'll talk to you later, that kind of thing. It doesn't go anywhere, so they pack up in their car and they drive off. Well, Lance actually sees one of the other Sykeston cars out there, and he goes over there to complain and argue with the head of the SWAT team that was out there. And while they're standing there doing that, one of the members of the SWAT team out in the woods had rolled off his rucksack, caught his trigger, and let go a round that struck the car. Nobody was hurt. An officer inside the car caught a kind of a very minor shrapnel wound, but nobody was hurt. But Lance was livid. And eventually he threw them off the property, and presumably he went to sleep. But that next morning on his way to work, he stopped by that command shed where they were working and demanded to see Heath and Mills, who were not present at the time, and said, so he told them, well, I want to talk to them. And they said, well, we'll find them and send them where you're at, where you're going to be at. He told them his construction site. When he gets to the construction site that morning, at some point he has a conversation with Tyler Cleaver, who is a friend, co-worker, I think a distant cousin down there, that kind of thing. And he tells Tyler about this incident with the police coming by and the accidental discharge, and tells him if the cops want to come out there, I'll shoot it out with them. I'm happy to play cowboys and Indians, using all kinds of talk like that. Around lunchtime is when Heath and Mills show up to interview him, and Lance tells them purposely, hey, I'll talk to you, but I'm eating my lunch first. You just sit right there and wait. And he goes over and gets in the truck with Tyler. And he and Tyler are in there eating their lunch, and when they do, Lance calls Corey. And Tyler can hear Lance's version of the conversation and some of what Corey is saying. But Lance basically asks her, hey, have two men been to see you? Yes. What did you tell them? Tyler reports, she says, well, I told him you and I were here till 5:30 and hadn't left, that kind of thing, given the beginning of an alibi. And he said to her, good, that should work. At that point in time, he went over and spoke to the troopers, and they began the first of what probably would be considered their first interview with him. And
how did that unfold? How did that interview?
well, I think all of them were a little antagonistic because of the way Lance's attitude was towards law enforcement. I don't think he liked to be questioned. I think he was offended that his family and friends were being questioned. And but they talked to him there in the vehicle. He's asked basically what he did on Sunday. He talks about having been home all day long watching basketball. It happened to be the NCAA tournament that weekend, and that he had asked his neighbor Sylvan for help with moving this brush or timber out there. But he never helped Sylvan. Sylvan later told us that I went over there to get Lance to help. I knocked, nobody answered. I went ahead and did it without him. He said Corey left, and he described Sylvan coming over and working that, well, I'd asked him for help. I was supposed to help him, but I stayed inside just watching him do the work. And then around 5 to 6, he had gone to Uncle Robert's, and on the way back there, stopped by the Duncans, Sylvan and Carol again, and spoke to them briefly, and describing his day in that manner. That he was basically at home except for leaving 5 or 6 to go to his uncle's and then return and talk to the Duncans. So his alibi was the Duncans, his uncle, and his wife. They would ask him about, well, do you own any type of guns? And he would just real flippant, I own all kinds of guns. I own all kinds of guns. Well, what about rifles? I own them all. Shotguns, I own them all. What about handguns? I own them all. He would not give specifics, and he was just kind of being, just
Almost flippant.
just flippant,
perhaps.
just arrogant, very flippant and very arrogant. And he warned them, if you're going to come to my property again, you need to bring a warrant, or you're not getting on my property. Sergeant Mills then began to ask him about leaving the scene of the accident, and what do you know about this? And all he said was, basically, hey, Jeff had used my truck. I met Sergeant Graham that night for the first time. Later, he changes that because he did remember another brief meeting they had. But that was the first time I met him. He came by the house and talked to Cindy and us, and that was really all he knew about it. And said, if you guys need to speak to me again, you can call me. I'll speak to you, but it's not going to be at my house. It'll be somewhere else. Now, after work that day, he goes back to his grandmother's house. Heath and Mills leave. He goes to his grandmother's house, and he wants to know, he's trying to find out who the cops all have been talking to. And tells his grandmother that I don't think anybody didn't buy yet. She tells his grandmother that if the cops come by, just tell them, to your knowledge, I've been home all day. And he holds his finger, and she says she won't lie for him. And he says, just tell them I was home all day, and holds up his finger and says, shh, to her. And just that's the story you should tell. On the way then to his house, he stops again by the Duncans, and now word is all over town about kind of what has happened. And he talks to the Duncans a little bit, and the conversation turns to this murder, and Lance is telling Sylvan that he had heard that Sergeant Graham's face from this turkey load that had been used, he heard resulted in basically Sergeant Graham's entire face being peeled back, which I think is significant because that information wasn't out there. And while Sergeant Graham's face was not peeled back, it was brutally peppered with this shotgun
Suffered some
pellets.
serious impact.
Yeah.
So you have this investigation going on here, and it's at this point everything is.
He has one other visit though that night. He goes again to Uncle Robert. Again, he's trying to find out who the cops have talked to and what they have told him, which is very suspicious.
Mm-hmm.
And Robert says, I told him the truth. I told him you wanted to borrow my truck. I told him Corey brought me ammo, and I'm not going to lie for you. And he wanted to know and pressed him on what he told him and what Grandma may have told him. And as that conversation ends, Robert says to him, and he kind of called him boy, I think, but he said, boy, what have you done? Shockley just responds simply, nothing, and leaves.
So you have Shockley essentially shopping for information while this investigation is going on. You have what I would call circumstantial evidence at this point. And in speaking of that, there was additional evidence obtained during the investigation, shell casings, if I remember correctly. There were various shell casings recovered during the initial investigation after the death of Sergeant Graham. Can you talk a little bit about the shell casings and how pivotal or crucial those were in this instance?
Well, first of all, if you recall, Sergeant Graham was shot with a high-powered rifle. The bullet that they extracted from his body was of a .22 or .24 caliber class. If the listeners know anything about ballistics, they know a bullet is made of lead and it's soft, and when it hits something, it'll change its shape and appearance. And this bullet had to first go through Sergeant Graham's vest. Those vests aren't designed to stop those types of bullets from that kind of range. And so it would have mushroomed, tore up, and disformed. It then hit his various parts of his body, including his spinal cord, but it had lost sufficient power, probably because of that going through that vest the first time, that it didn't leave his body. And so a very broken up, fragmented bullet was found. The police ultimately, Highway Patrol, began an extensive search of Lance's property. Lance at one time had a sawmill out there, and so outside his cabin nearby was this pile of sawdust. And when I say pile of sawdust, this thing was probably 30, 40 feet high.
Yeah, we're not just talking a little mound. It was enormous.
Huge pile of sawdust, maybe 100 feet in length. And they began sifting through that for any bullet fragments, because we learned that Lance would come out there with friends, drink on the picnic table, shoot at this sawdust pile and the trees all around them. Well, they soon realized that the patrol had sent down two members of the crime lab, Todd Garrison, who was a firearms expert, and Carl Rotho, who was a tracer expert, to help sift through the evidence they got to see what was should be sent up to the lab. And I think they slowly realized that while they were finding bullets in this sawdust pile, they weren't going to be successful there, and they began actually searching that tree line too. And they eventually found 4 bullets out in that tree line in trees that were shot by a .243 caliber weapon, and they were taken to the lab. And the criminalist Jason Crafton was able to say that those bullets fired at the Shockley house into those trees were a match with this fragmented up bullet from Sergeant Graham's body, which is a very, very good piece of evidence to have.
That's substantial.
But even more importantly, I think, might have been because of the nature of that fragmented evidence and the concerns with that, where, as you mentioned, the shell casings. What this investigation turned up was, at the Shockley residence, they found a number of shell casings from a .243 weapon that had been fired out there. And he's got none in the home, none in his trucks. They also found out a friend of his, Chris Long, one of these guys that would come out there, barbecue and shoot. When they did this, his son would pick up the brass and shell casings like a kid would do to collect.
Sure.
And in that, they went and got that bag, and in that bag were a number of .243 shell casings that would have come from that residence. And the patrol, in searching and going out to Robert Shockley, the uncle's house, obviously they found amidst all his .223 ammunition, that box that Corey brought of .243, but outside that property, he had .223 shell casings, spent shell casings all over his property. But they had heard a story about Lance having gone out there with his .243 and with some stray dog and shooting and killing this dog. And so a trooper by the name of Don Wyndham took it upon himself to search every single shell casing he could find out there, in the ground, in the house, everywhere. And amongst all those .223 shell casings, probably hundreds of them, Don Wyndham found one shell casing that was spent from a .243 weapon. And all that shell casing from the Robert Young house to the bag that the Long boy had carried off from the barbecue to the ones that were actually found at the Shockley residence were taken to the crime lab. And they were able to say, looking at the firing pin impressions and extractor marks, that I think there were 29 of those. They were able to say 26 of them were fired from the same weapon, a .243 weapon, the same weapon. And that would have put Lance out shooting at Uncle Robert's house as well as at his own house, a .243 that it magically has not shown up.
That can be found nowhere.
That can be found nowhere.
Okay. What about, as this investigation's unfolding, this circumstantial evidence keeps surfacing and it's building and it's increasing. At what point does the patrol gather enough information where they feel comfortable to arrest Shockley?
Well, what the investigators did initially was on March 23rd, which would have been 3 days after the homicide, they had taken now, having learned about that buccal swab, the blood that Sergeant Graham had seized from the overturned pickup truck killing Jeff Bayless, that had been at the lab. And when they first learned about that, they rushed that DNA testing, and they learned it came back to Lance Shockley. And so what they decided to do to turn the pressure up was to arrest Lance at his place of employment, or his work site. But before doing that, there was actually another conversation that troopers Heath and Mills had with him.
Share that with us.
They had, when they were going and learning and talking to his friends, they went to talk to Chris Long. I mentioned him a moment ago. Mm-hmm. His son was the one that policed up all that brass. When they get to talk to Chris Long, he's holding his cell phone out there, and it soon becomes apparent to Heath and Mills that he has called somebody and someone is listening on the line to that conversation. And so they find out from Chris it's Lance, and they get on the phone with Lance, and Lance says, come back out here to my house. Stop talking to my friends. If you want to talk to me. And so they do. And when they get out there, Lance this time meets him on the porch, is very angry, very confrontational. First thing he demands is to know who was the Sykeston officer he was talking to out there. And they write that down on a piece of paper for him. And he demands to know their names. And he writes that out on a piece of paper. And he opens the door a crack and sets that piece of paper right inside the door, but doesn't let them come in. He's demanding why they're talking to his friends, why they're talking to his family. And they're telling him, well, they're trying to see if your story checks out. And he's like, well, I told you what my story is. You don't need to check with them. He keeps getting angrier and angrier. He's demanding to know who they're talking to and why they're talking to them.
As somebody not involved with that at all, it seems like he's becoming increasingly alarmed at the progress they're making here.
I think what happens oftentimes, not in every case, a suspect who is going to be a defendant often wants to know what they have on me, and they're trying to find out.
Right.
A lot of times interviews maybe question and answer where the cops are asking them questions and they're answering them, maybe confessing. But sometimes those interviews even turn to where it's the suspect asking. The important part that comes out of the interview is the suspect asking questions to try and find out what they know. And that's clearly what Lance is doing.
So he's trying to solicit information from the troopers there. How does that unfold?
Well, it keeps getting angrier and more confrontational, and Lance begins pointing in Sergeant Mills' face, and he's demanding why they talk to his wife. And they explain to him, we didn't talk to your wife, others have, but we are not the ones that have talked to her. He continues to get irate and angry, and he calls them liars. And Sergeant Heath decides that, well, I don't think he decides. He's kind of feeling like I've had enough of this bull crap from this guy. And he points his finger back and says, I am not a liar. I don't have any reason to lie. And you better, you have no reason to say that. And with that, Lance reaches up and slaps Heath's hand away. And Mills is standing there and realizes, hey, this isn't doing us any good. And he steps in there and says, hey, listen, we're done here. We're done talking to you, Lance. And they start walking away. And as they do, Lance says, nope, come back, let's talk. And Heath and Mills are like, no, we're done with you. We're done with you. So that is the last time he's interviewed before he gets arrested for the leaving the scene of the accident. So the next day, March 23rd, they decide to have a trooper that is not in what you would think of a highway patrolman out on the roads, policing the roads, who's not involved in this investigation, to go pick him up like they would have done anyway if he was just getting arrested for leaving the scene. And that officer's Mike Rainey, and he goes and arrests him, tells him why he's being arrested, and reads him his Miranda rights. He then drives him a short distance and puts him in a car with Heath and Mills. And I remember right, Mills is driving, Heath's in the front passenger seat, but he's turned around talking to Lance, who's in the back. And he begins asking Lance, do you know why you're here? And he's been arrested for leaving the scene, and Lance says, well, it's for killing Sergeant Graham. And which maybe not the best answer if you're leaving the scene.
Right.
But that was his answer. And so Heath starts asking him questions, and it starts asking him about his grandmother's car. Hey, when did you last drive it? When have you had it? And he keeps saying, I was home all day. I didn't take the car. I was home all day. And that's when they spring upon him. Grandma initially did lie to the police, said, well, she took it to church that day, but she later told the truth. And they tell her, well, your grandmother says you took that car that day, and they ask him, is she lying? He says, no, she's not a liar. She is not a liar. And are you calling her a liar? And are you saying she's lying? He says, no, I'm not saying she's lying. And so they go around this a little bit, and Heath then brings up the 243 shell, the box that Corey took, and says, Lance, they know she took that box of shell casings to Roberts to hide. And when Sergeant Heath confronts him with that information that we know she hid or tried to get rid of this box, Lance is in the back and just drops physically his head, but does not respond. He doesn't say a word. And Heath just keeps on him. I think he just is trying to wear him down, trying to see what he will say, and keeps going through all the information we've gotten through at this point, the shell casings, the hiding them, Grandma saying he had the car, the Duncan's not supporting his alibi, he wasn't with them, didn't talk
It's
to them.
starting to stack up here.
Yeah, and they're just, and if you know Jeff Heath, he can be persistent.
That's the word I was going to use.
He can be very persistent.
Yep.
And and I think at one point during this trip, when Lance has kind of gotten quiet, Jeff actually has Terry pull over and steps out of the vehicle and calls his superior and says, "Hey, here's where we're at. Do you want me to keep on him?" And the instructions he were given is, well, you keep riding him until he takes the fifth. And that's what Jeff does. And Lance eventually says to him, I'm not going to tell you a thing. You're just going to have to run all this information through. Heath keeps on telling him. And ultimately, the conversation ends when Lance looks at him and says very calmly, I don't know how to say this to you nicely, but would you just shut the fuck up? And that's pretty much the end of that conversation.
All right.
The patrol kept looking into the case, kept doing more investigation. They were holding him on a bond now for that crime. And later that week, on March 29th, the local prosecuting attorney then issued a warrant for the arrest of the murder of Sergeant Graham.
At what point does the Missouri Attorney General's office step in and you become involved?
Well, in our state, our office, the Missouri Attorney General's office, does not have original jurisdiction of these types of crimes. We're available in these small communities when there's a conflict of interest. Maybe the prosecutor knows the family, and they would file a motion with the court and ask for our assistance. The other process is they can ask for our help without a conflict. They do that by writing the governor a letter, basically saying, under this statute, can you direct the AG to help? And then the AG writes us a letter saying, I'm directing you under this statute to help. And that's how our office got involved. I myself got involved before that process had happened. I think the week after well, let me back up a little bit. I had worked with a lot of these troopers over the years. I knew them very well. And in this case and other cases that are completely unrelated, it wasn't uncommon for me to get phone calls asking for advice, how to do
Sure.
this.
Hey, what do you think of this?
Legal opinions.
Right.
And, in those cases, I always have to tell them, here's what I think, but make sure the local prosecutor's on.
Correct.
So as this case was going on, I still have a distinct memory of sitting down with my family for Easter and my beeper going off repeatedly and having to take a call to answer a question for Trooper Cooper, and did so. But that's how I knew about it in the media a little bit, but I became more and more involved. That following week after the arrest, the captain in charge of the investigative wing of the Highway Patrol, Ron Replogo, asked me and two seasoned detectives, one from St. Louis City Homicide, one from Kansas City Homicide, to basically Monday morning the quarterback and see if we could suggest to them anything they should still do or shouldn't do in the future kind of thing. And we gave them those suggestions. And while that was going on, the local prosecutor, a guy named Michael Liggins, he later became a judge and he's now a prosecutor again, real good guy, had asked our office to assist through that process. And so I would say within about 3 weeks of the murder, our office was formally asked to help and I was assigned to the case.
Okay, so take us from the point of the local prosecutor files charges. Ultimately, the request is made, and you guys step in to the prosecution. Walk us through that. Where does Kevin go? What do you begin? Where do you begin?
Well, I had already begun. When I typically get a case, I will read through every report and make like an index of what that person is saying, where that information can be found, so I can look it up, a cheat sheet. And I had done that in preparation for meeting with those two detectives to review the case. So I had that under my belt. But I went, one of my first meetings was to meet with some of the key investigators in the case to make sure we were all on the same page and some additional things could be done that I felt should be done. One of them was, and it came out of that group work with me and the two detectives, I recognized right away this case had circumstantial evidence, and a lot of the key information was coming from Lance's family and friends. And unfortunately, Troll did not, in part of their investigation, had not recorded those conversations or taken written statements. And I was concerned if those people backed up on us, we would have to impeach them. And it would be better than having the officer say they told me this and it'd be a swearing contest in this kind of case, that they had either a written statement that we could say, well, didn't you write this out and didn't you write this? Or you were recorded and didn't you say this? And so I had them instructed, and they did go back to a number of these key witnesses and nail them down like that.
So didn't there was additional footwork that helped solidify where the direction you were going.
It could make the prosecution easier.
Correct.
Because we were concerned about that, them backing up on it. Doesn't mean they couldn't back up, but it's a lot harder to back up and say, I didn't, for instance, Grandma Shockley, and she did on the stand try to avoid saying again that she initially lied. But the choice is then for a prosecutor is, well, do you want to bring the police officer in to say it in a swearing contest, or do you want to bring the police officer in and say, she told me this, and look, she wrote it down, or I recorded her? It's easier to win that kind of contest. And so I felt that needed to be done. But we had that conversation, and I think either that kind of same day or within a couple of days, I sat down and, like I do in just about any case, and met with the victim's family to explain to them the long and tough process that they're going to go through, especially in a case where the death penalty is being sought.
Right. And that's an important issue to mention here. Is this is a death penalty case, and the stakes are high here. And just from knowing you, I know how detail oriented you are, and you kind of take it in this type of scenario. I would envision or imagine you might be self-imposing some pressures on yourself to ensure that you do the right thing for Sergeant Graham, for Sergeant Graham's family, for the Highway Patrol family as well. Can you just talk briefly about that? Did you feel any differently in this specific case than any other, higher profile cases that you've worked?
Well, I would say I did feel and impose more pressure on myself, but I want to say something too. At the beginning, I think you used the phrase that I was the lead prosecutor and led this case. I had we had a changeover with attorney generals right before the trial years later, and my new boss came in and second chaired me and helped me out with the trial. Page Bellamy was his name, and so I wasn't alone, but I did feel not pressure from the patrol. I never felt anything from the patrol except, what do you need from us? I didn't feel pressure from the family. You know, I my pressures were twofold. One, I can't imagine losing a loved one in this manner, and so that was different. You know, different than some murders. And I've never been a police officer. I've never walked up on a car in the middle of the night having to feel those, but I can imagine what they have to go through. And a lot of these guys were my friends. You know, I've known them over the years. Oftentimes have been asked to come down and maybe train them on, give a lecture on search and seizure, and we'd go have beers afterwards. And they were my friends. And I saw in their eyes how differently this case had affected them. And I think part of it was, the manner in which he was killed, like Colonel Stottlemyre said, and not wanting to let them down, and not wanting to have this guy escape justice with a highly circumstantial evidence case. I did feel a lot of pressure, but it wasn't from really outside sources. To give you an example of that, how these officers felt. An officer, I won't name his name because I don't know if he wants me to say this, but I've known him for years. Just a tremendous guy, and he doesn't believe in a death penalty. But that's because he thinks it's fruitless because of how long it takes. It means nothing. And one of the first times we were together on this case, he says, "Hey, Kevin, you know how I feel about the death penalty?" Because he's testified in a number of other trials I had. And I said, "Yeah." He says, "Well, this case is different." He's sort of joking with me, but I could see how sincere he was.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That makes complete sense.
This episode of the Right to Remain Silent podcast is brought to you by Streetwise 360 Law Enforcement Consulting, your go-to resource for expert law enforcement training. Whether it's conducting successful criminal investigations, performing undercover work, mastering interviews, conducting surveillance, utilizing confidential informants, or case strategy, Streetwise 360 gives officers the real-world skills they need for success. Learn more at streetwise-360.com, because knowledge is power in the field. Now back to the show.
All right. So let's go ahead and talk about the trial. If you could kind of walk us through how it unfolded from your perspective, and just tell us about that.
Well, it took too long to get to trial.
Yeah, what kind of a time frame from the unfortunate day that Sergeant Graham was killed until the start of the trial? What kind of a time frame are we looking at?
Well, back then, what I would have told the family when we had those meetings was I would have anticipated it being about 2 years. It took 4 years, and the way our judicial system has changed, I would not tell a family today 2 years. That would be the minimum, is what I would tell them now. But it took 4 years. All of that was due to the defense not doing their job, thoroughly. I mean, obviously they got a different opinion of that than I would, but I actually started in this case a list of stupid, worthless, time-consuming things that they were doing, so that when they would file their motion for continuance, I could remind the judge of this. And I can give you an example or two if you'd like.
Sure, yeah, please do.
Well, the very first person they deposed, they got to depose everybody, which there's written reports. My experience with the public defender system is that a deposition usually consists of the officer or the witness basically recounting what's in the report. Very seldom do they flesh out something that's unknown or really, really lock them into answers that will benefit their client. They
And-
don't do it.
And that's a great point you mentioned. He is being represented by the state public defender's office, correct?
Well, through basically the first 3.5 years he was.
Okay.
They eventually cited a conflict and got out. And then two private attorneys, well, three at trial, but two private attorneys were contracted by the public defender's office to actually handle the case.
Okay.
And that made me a little nervous because those attorneys were very good and knew what they were doing. I'm not knocking the skills of the public defender's office, but oftentimes what I've seen is and heard from feedback is the jury sees them wasting time complaining about useless stuff, and it doesn't help their client. And quite frankly, I think they're there because of their ideology, not necessarily because of their skill set. And I guess I should add, those are the views of Kevin Zoellner, not the Attorney General's office.
Right. Right. Right.
But the first, so in a case like this, and tragically, it seems to be happening in more and more cases. It used to be just capital cases. They wanted to depose everybody and their brother. And so the very first person they deposed in this case, and it took about 3 hours, was a helicopter pilot. That helicopter pilot simply ferried evidence from down in Van Buren up to the crime lab. Normally a trooper would just drive it up, but this thing is going on every time they could. They were ferrying it up there so it could get looked at right away. And he basically landed the helicopter, had a trooper with the evidence jump in, drove him to the flew him to the airport in Jeff City, and sat and waited until he had to go back down. And that's
what he stated in his deposition.
That was their high priority, and the first person. I can give you numerous examples of them just wasting time. But that's what they did, and then they begged for continuances. And so that's why it took 4 years. So that, that was, I can get used to that. I don't necessarily expect the Highway Patrol family to be happy with that delay.
Right.
But the family is the one that's really hard to try to explain these things to, and you hope they have confidence in you, so that when you tell them something, the goal I always like is they may not understand, they may not agree with it, they may not like it, but they understand it, and that's
Sure.
so. But it took about 4 years to get to trial. Originally, the defense and I had agreed, since Van Buren is so rural, and in a capital murder case, it's the only kind in Missouri where the jury is required to be sequestered. That means when the trial starts, they're in the care and custody of the bailiffs. They stay together for meals, for dinners, spending the night in a hotel.
Right. They're not allowed out. They're not allowed to monitor newspapers.
They're not allowed to call home. And today's day and age of cell phones and laptops, there are some people that look like they would have a mental breakdown if
Right.
they were asked to serve.
Wouldn't make it.
If they were asked to serve. But originally, our judge was a circuit judge who'd been, because it's change of judge and venue, was a judge out of Cape Girardeau County. Cape Girardeau has 2 courthouses and is a much bigger town in terms of keeping a jury happy in a nice, clean hotel, as well as being able to feed them something different every night.
Sure.
And so we had agreed, he's our judge, let's try it over there. It's his courthouse, the jury will be happy, and he can control things much easier in his own courthouse. I think the defense recognized their better option would be not to seek a change of venue, because Carter County was such a small county. Lance Shockley's family was, if you will, politically connected. I think his grandfather at one time was the county commissioner. But the bottom line is everybody knew everybody. And my fear was, and I'm hoping their logic was, that it's going to be hard to convict somebody and sentence them to death and then show up at the local grocery store and see the man's family.
Right.
And so they backed out of our agreement, if you will. And instead, we wound up picking the jury there in Van Buren in Carter County with Carter County residents. And our new judge was from Howe County, a little bit further west. And and we used his courthouse over in West Plains, Missouri. And so after that jury was picked, they were transported over there and sequestered for the remainder of the trial.
So you've got a jury of Carter County residents with the trial occurring in Howell County.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And jury selection took probably 3 or 4 days without looking. And I think we did that ending on a Friday, and we started that trial then Monday. So the jurors were allowed to go home. They were given instructions, information, and then they showed back up. I think they showed up Sunday evening, and they were transported to the hotel, and then we started the trial bright and early Monday morning.
Okay.
And that trial then, the entire trial wrapped up Saturday, the following Saturday. So basically 6 days.
So it goes Monday through that Saturday.
Saturday, correct.
Okay. Well, talk a little bit about the trial, about the testimony. Were there any surprises to you from your perspective? Did any of the witnesses change their stories, or just kind of walk us through those days of the trial?
Well, the trial actually, I would say, went as well as expected for Paige and I. Our concerns were witnesses backing up or changing their stories, and we had really developed good relationships with them, even though they didn't like it. Corey Chilton, it was her fiance Jeff that was killed, was very reluctant at first. And in fact, Jeff Heath and I spent quite a bit of time when we could stopping by, talking to her, and it took quite a bit of encouraging for her to come forward and testify, not reluctantly, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Sergeant Scott Stolting and I did the same with Amelia May Shockley, his grandmother. But for the most part, the hard work of the troopers in working with these witnesses paid off. That when we were able to meet with them and prep with them to get them ready for their testimony, that they were knowledgeable and not playing the I don't recall game.
Sure.
And they all testified with there were a few nudges here. If Grandma Shockley needed a nudge at one point in time, and if you'd like me to tell you that, I can.
Yeah, share the details of that interaction.
She was one of our last witnesses. We decided that because it would make a pretty good impression on the jury that to have one of our last witnesses be his grandmother saying he took his car and told her shush when she asked about talking to the police. When she was first interviewed by a member of the Highway Patrol, her first story was, nobody took my car. And we knew it had been taken because, let me back up. If you recall, her car that Lance took would have been parked nearby where the murder took place. There was a couple, Roger and Lisa Hart, who were looking for a home in that area and drove by and saw that car and later described it and then identified it later. And they put it right around before that time frame, earlier in the afternoon, around 1:30 in the afternoon, if I recall. So he was sitting out there for a while. Rick Ham was a NASCAR enthusiast, if you will, and he was watching a NASCAR race that day. And he was waiting for that final minute for the final checkered flag so that he could run to the store, grab him what he was going to barbecue and barbecue that night. And so if you remember, Sergeant Graham went off duty at 4:03. Right around 4 o'clock, he said that race ended, or right before 4 o'clock, that race ended. He didn't stay for the post-race commentary stuff, and he ran to town, and that car was right there on that road. He got his barbecue and stuff and came home. That car was still there. He may have left early, or actually there was an earlier trip. The race may have ended like at 3, not 4. But then when he gets home, the car's still there. He forgot barbecue sauce to barbecue. And so he left again, and this time the car is missing or has disappeared. And so we knew that car had been there, but Grandma said she took it to church that day and had been home all alone. Later, the law enforcement officers talked to her again, and she ultimately told the truth. And so we knew it would be important to make her comfortable testifying against her grandson, and we spent quite a bit of time with her. And I went to her house and talked to her, and it came up in the trial that she was always offering Scott Stolting and me pie, and why we never had pie and why we wanted to have pie. That was a big question for the defense. But anyway, when she starts testifying, or well, before she testified, when I would meet with her, I would show her the written statements and reports where she said these things. And I also showed her the first one because it's usually good, I think, if somebody has lied, to present that lie first, explain to them why they lied. In this case, it would be, I love my grandson. I didn't want to get in trouble. I sincerely believe she was horrified by what happened to Sergeant Graham, but the saying sometimes is blood is thicker than water. And when I met with her, she had told me in very stern grandmotherly voice that I was not to talk about those lies, and I was not to show her those papers of where she said that. And so when she was called to the stand, I was doing my best to avoid that, but she was kind of fudging a little bit, and I thought it would be appropriate to show her and remind her of an earlier statement. And so as I picked those papers up to walk to her, I think kind of forgot we were in court and yelled a little, not yelled, but she raised her voice, Kevin, and was shaking her fist at me and said, "I told you not to bring those papers up here." And so I said, "Well, yes, you did." And I think we moved along, but it ultimately resolved, because of that, I wound up having to call Scott Stolting because I wanted the jury to know that. But that was an example of one of them kind of
One of those
backing up.
incidents.
And Amelia May was actually under quite a bit of pressure because she was a nice Christian woman. And whenever we had court, she and Lance's family would come. And because I'd gotten to know her, I was trying to, maybe it's cynical, but part of my job is to make sure justice is done. I knew she was important, so I would take time and stop and talk to her. And when I would do, Lance's cousins and others would berate her for even talking to me, and that sort of thing. And so I knew she was in a horrible position, but I also want to say, I think she has passed on, but I will give her credit. 3 times after the trial was over, she'd called me at home. Well, I think on my cell phone, but I was at home. And 3 times she wanted to explain and apologize to me why she shook her fist and raised her voice with me. And our conversation was always the same: is, I understand you love Lance, and nobody is going to change that. We know this crime has affected your family too, and I deeply respect that in the end you told the truth. But she called several times wanting to simply apologize for having done that.
And I think that speaks volumes to your approach on cases that you prosecute. That shows that there was a connection, that woman respected you enough to call you, not just once, but a couple times, in order to relay that.
It's also possible that she's just a good Christian woman and wanted to get to heaven too,
That probably was some incentive as well.
But yes.
But let me ask you this, from your perspective as the prosecutor on this case, what were some of the biggest challenges that you faced in the prosecution?
Well, I think I've talked about it several times. One of the biggest challenges, fears, if you will, were these witnesses backing up on us.
Correct.
It's very easy to say, well, any crime takes place and Johnny gets accused of it. His family and friends, oh, Johnny's not capable of that kind of thing.
Right.
Now, these folks had told us things, and them backing up for whatever reason. There was several people down there that feared Lance. Some of his friends, other people in the community feared him just because they knew somewhat of his reputation.
Well, let me pause you there. And it's something that I think I glossed over was there was a statement by Lance. Was it a game warden or something where he said something to the effect of, "Hey, I like you, but that uniform you're wearing." What was that scenario?
Well, Chester Brewer was a deputy at Carter County, and he'd been there. Older man, long-time resident. I think everybody knew Chester Brewer. And this goes back to, I think, the first encounter that Sergeant Graham may have had with Lance. I mentioned the tourist industry down there is floating. Well, a lot of people get on the river and they do a lot of stupid things, whether there's drugs or drinking. And I think Lance had been drinking, violating whatever rules there are for drinking on the river, that kind of thing, and got arrested, I believe, by either the Water Patrol or one of the Rangers. And Sergeant Graham served just to transport him from that scene of the river to the county jail, which was very, very small. Chester Brewer was working that night in the jail, and when Sergeant Graham brought him in, what Lance said to Chester Brewer, and Chester later testified to this during the penalty phase, was that he said, "Chester, I've known you all my life and I respect you, but I will never respect that uniform you're wearing."
That speaks to the viewpoint strongly of Shockley's perspective there. Let me ask you this: back to challenges in this trial. Did you have a concern over the circumstantial evidence that this was based on? Were you overly concerned about that, or were you confident going into this trial? How
Well-
did you feel?
Well, I was very concerned about it, but I was very confident because there was an incredible amount of circumstantial evidence. And in that, a lot of that evidence was buttressed or backed up or provided by his family and friends. And I felt, one of my arguments I later made to the jury was, this isn't a cop got shot situation. The cops can't prove it, and so they go out and make up a bunch of lies. This is a cop getting shot and his family and friends telling you what he did. And these are his family and friends telling you that he was inquiring the morning of the murder, where does he live? And so lo and behold, the guy gets shot at his house. It's his family and friends telling you he took her car that was seen by residents in the community. It was his family and friends, his uncle telling him about the dog that got shot, the 243 casing that's out there, and the box of 243 ammo that Corey brought. There are tons of these details, and I think in my experience, this is probably, we don't handle some of the kind of cases like the feds do, but I think I called 43 witnesses in this case.
That's
And
what I
it's
was going to ask.
probably by far the most. Most murder cases, you can probably try with 20 witnesses, maybe less, depending on the circumstances. But we called 43 witnesses, and it's a challenge to, unlike what happens on TV shows, it's a challenge to get the jury to understand sometimes how all those pieces fit together, especially when you may have to call a witness. It's nice to explain things chronologically and build upon things, but sometimes the way our judicial system works and sometimes witnesses' schedules, you have to call people somewhat out of order and put pieces together. And in a highly circumstantial evidence case, getting the jury to understand those fundamentals is challenging, but very important. And those were, I think, the big concerns is, would his family and friends step up, and would the jury understand those circumstances? Because the Highway Patrol did a tremendous investigation. I just look, and I've said it before to other people, I just look like I showed up and told their story or helped them tell the story. They did the investigation, and we mentioned earlier possible suspects. We talked about the Water Patrolman, and obviously that's prime suspect, but the patrol pulled out, there was a young kid who had some kind of beef. I forgot what it was with Sergeant Graham, and he had put some flour or sand in Sergeant Graham's vehicle. They went out and interviewed that kid. I mean, highly unlikely this kid had no connection, but they thoroughly interviewed him and checked his alibi out. And there were other instances like that too, but they are deserving of the credit for Lance Shockley getting convicted because they did this hard work and put these pieces together.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I agree with that wholeheartedly. Let me ask you this, talking about the trial and witnesses and whatnot. Sergeant Graham had a young son at the time of his death. I think you said he was 4 when he died. So fast forward 4 years to the trial. Did his son testify during the trial or the penalty phase? Do you recall?
Oh, I'll never forget. But Hayden is his name. He's a young man now, doing very well. But Hayden, after I got involved in the case, I spent some time with him 2 or 3 times just to make him comfortable. And Sergeant Graham, his mom, Tammy, Sergeant Graham's ex, testified also and talked about what kind of man and father Sergeant Graham was. But as the trial progressed, one of the hard things that always makes me feel dirty is kind of, I don't know how to phrase it other than preying upon the emotions of these victims' family to tell that story so the jury understands that emotion.
They have to fully, yeah, that's a great way to put it. They have to understand that.
And you feel, I at least feel guilty at times preying upon that a little bit. I did it with troopers. Colonel Stottlemyre testified about those statements we talked about earlier about how this one hits harder, but I knew Colonel Stottlemyre didn't play a role in the investigation. He oversaw it, made sure things got done. But he visited that crime scene, and that pad of concrete where Sergeant Graham died was very bloody. And he stood there one day and had to tell his officers to get that he wanted his man's blood cleaned up as soon as possible. And I remember him telling me that in a very, very emotional manner, and also to the jury.
Yeah.
But in Missouri, when we try a capital case, there's actually 2 small trials. The first part is the guilt phase. You have to prove the defendant's guilty of murder in the first degree, which we did. I think the jury deliberated about 2.5 hours, even though we had this very highly circumstantial evidence case. I think the jury was able to put it together through the witnesses very well, and I didn't expect them to deliberate that short. Then we moved on to the penalty portion of the trial, where the jury has to decide whether he should receive a sentence of death or life imprisonment. And that's when we talk more about the type of person Sergeant Graham is, as well as the type of person Lance Shockley was. And so our very last witness at that part of the trial was Hayden Graham. And prior to him, his mother Tammy had testified about how Hayden once drew a picture of his daddy getting shot by Lance Shockley, and how she's had to deal with that. But Hayden testified, and he didn't testify very long. We asked him who he was, and asked him the kinds of things he enjoyed with his dad. And then the very last question I asked of him in the whole trial was, I told him I did not have the power to do so, but that if I did, and I could bring his dad back for one day, what would he like to do? And Hayden said that he would just really like to be able to just hang out with his dad.
Yeah. That just relays the love of a son to his father. And it really brings home the severity of this case. That's something, like you said earlier, that sticks with you. You just can't forget a statement like that from a family member. Let's transition to still talking about the trial, but the defense. What kind of a defense, if any, was there during this trial?
Well, the majority of the defense was saying the cops had the wrong guy. You know, somebody else did it. All these circumstances does not prove that Lance did it. That they tried to inject a different red car that was seen into the in the area at the time. They tried to, you know, describe, if you go back and look at the things Sergeant Heath and Mills got from Lance, they were very minor points. He didn't confess, obviously, but there were very minor points, and his body language was significant. I think it was a pretty telling statement when they confronted him with Corey taking a box of his ammo to Robert that night, and his response is not just to say nothing, it's to drop his head down and almost physically collapse in front of him and not say nothing. So, but they that was the gist of their defense. This can't be trusted. The other thing they did that really kind of burned me a little bit inside was to attack Sergeant Graham. And the way they did it was not him as a person, but if you recall, he restarted this investigation on that fateful weekend in March by going to see Ivy Napier. And he told her a white lie, which law enforcement is allowed to lie. And they're allowed to tell much bigger lies than, hey, Lance told me the truth. You need to tell me the truth. And they're allowed to do that under the Constitution or our laws. So I'm not complaining about them pointing that out, but they really carried on a little bit about how outlandish and how horrible this was, that of Sergeant Graham, and what kind of person kind of says about him that he would lie in this manner. And I think the reason they did that was not really any personal animus against Sergeant Graham, but this area of the state, I mentioned to you about the taking of some property.
Mm-hmm.
The area of the state has somewhat of that militia mentality of we do not like the government. And
Right.
I think they were trying to feed into the jurors thinking, well, if they think a cop lied, that's bad. And they, you know, but it was that combination of things. I really, at the time, didn't feel this way, but looking back now, when I review all this and think about the circumstances in the family, I really almost think they, you know, I didn't at the time. I thought, well, they don't really have a defense, but you know, with everything because they didn't. But
Yeah.
at the time, that's what they were trying to do, and they were trying to pick apart the family members and those circumstances and try to turn this jury against Sergeant Graham for having told a lie.
Were there any credible attempts by the defense to point to anybody specifically, or they just say the defense was it wasn't him, it was somebody else?
Well, our law doesn't allow a defense attorney to present evidence that someone else may have committed the crime or had a motive or opportunity to do so unless there's some direct connection to the crime. And there just wasn't that in this case. You know, for instance, I mentioned a young man who had thrown sand in his gas tank. If, let's say, when he did that, he left his hat behind, and that hat was found out there on Sergeant Graham's property, that would have been a direct connection. They could have said, hey, look here. But they didn't have that direct connection. The closest they came, and we filed a motion to keep that evidence out, or, you know, to keep the finger pointing out until they presented such evidence. And they tried to there was a woman who happened to be driving in the area with a similar red car.
Mm-hmm.
And she was interviewed and had nothing to it. But they tried to bring that up by asking officers questions. And we didn't want to be arguing about this in front of the jury because I didn't want them to think we were hiding something. But we'd go to the bench and object. And sometimes judges don't wish to make really firm rulings. And our judge in that area would always kind of just say, move along. And they would go back to it a little bit more. And at some point they were done. But the judge was
Sure.
kind of letting them point the finger in that direction, even though I don't believe the law should allow them. And, but it went nowhere. I mean,
Okay.
there was no other, okay.
Right.
It was his red car, but what about his grandma? What about Robert? What about
Right.
Mark Keeney? All those circumstances.
That
you know.
makes sense. Did Shockley testify at all?
He did not.
Okay.
Not in either portion of the trial.
Okay. Talk to us about the closing arguments. Kind of the mentality. How did you approach those closing arguments? Kind of bringing everything to a close with that jury.
Well, it was again, I think our goal was to remind them of all the circumstantial evidence. And in fact, a big part of that circumstantial evidence was that the bullet from Sergeant Graham's body matched to ones out in the woods. But we were always concerned about the damaged bullets. And I can understand this science a little bit, but there's some subjectivity in that by the call that the criminalist will make. And so what we did was talked about all the other evidence first. And we built up all the little circumstances. Who on that night had this happen in their life? Borrowed, the morning of, borrowed the car. The day of, had his wife get rid of those bullets. Guns that everybody says he's had or now. Build all of that up. And then reminded every step of the way that this isn't the highway patrol telling you these things. This is his family and friends. And then build up to those 26 of 29 shell casings that came from 3 separate locations. And Robert Shockley has told you only about one person that ever shot a 243 on his property, tying all that together. Again, it's his family and friends telling you this, and the lab is just telling you they're all the same. And then talking about that final shell case, or the actual projectile. But we tried to build along that way and then, challenge the jury. And, if, these are the kind of odds that win you the lottery, having that,
Right.
these are all these things fall into places where you win the lottery. Those were the kind of odds of that happening and Lance not being involved.
Yep. Bring it when in the conversations we've had leading up to today, I think you mentioned something that you told the jury about the 3 types of people in the world. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes, I do.
Could you share that?
And I have to acknowledge that it's borrowed from
Sure.
Lieutenant Colonel David Grossman. I think he was a ranger and psychiatrist. That his area of study is killing, the mentality, and how we train soldiers and law enforcement officers to kill and deal with that aftermath. And at one of his talks, he had kind of talked about the police being the sheepdog. And so from that, what I told the jury was that, I thought there were three kind of people in the world. There was the sheep. I was a sheep. Every one of us here is a sheep. We rely on the protection of the sheepdog. And the sheepdog in our society that protects us from the violent criminals are the police. And that in this case, our sheepdog, Sergeant Graham, was killed. And the third category of individuals in the world is that wolf. The wolf that looks around the flock when the sheepdog is not paying attention and tries to find the weakest among us to take off and kill for their dinner. And so there's the wolf, the sheep, and the sheepdog. And that basically that our sheepdog was gone. And so that to protect the rest of society from the people like Lance Shockley, I needed those 12 jurors to be our sheepdog. I basically told them words to that effect to encourage them and hopefully bolster them up to not only find them guilty, but ultimately sentence them to death.
In a short time after that, like you said, within a couple hours, they come back with a guilty verdict.
Yeah, I believe it was, I believe closing arguments were Friday morning, late morning. They deliberated for about 2.5 hours that afternoon and then found him guilty. And then we immediately began that penalty phase of the trial that afternoon and evening.
And then just briefly explain that penalty phase. It ended, how did it start? How did it end?
Well, again,
And where are we at now?
okay. Well, it's Friday afternoon, evening, and the one thing I think we talked about before, I don't know if you're getting at this, was interesting, was one of the pretrial motions the defense had filed was that they did not want any law enforcement officers in the crowd wearing their uniform. And in Missouri, the Highway Patrol, the uniformed officers that are wear I think their pants are a dark navy, maybe they're some lesser shade, but they're not black, and they wear a shirt, whether long sleeve or not, that's a French blue. And they didn't want them wearing those uniforms in order to incite the jury, inflame their passions and all that kind of stuff, which I can understand. I had a hard time explaining that to a lot of the members of the Highway Patrol. And so during those first Monday through Friday, those first portions of the trial, if you look out at the crowd, there were quite a few members of his family, but there was an overwhelming presence of Sergeant Graham's family, friends, and law enforcement. And I was confident that the jury sitting there looking around in that crowd would know a lot of those guys are cops, whatever they're wearing.
Mm-hmm.
But when that verdict happened, we had about an hour to start. There was a little break involved, give jury a break, and before we started the penalty phase. And I think all of these officers and our Paige and I and our investigator were staying at the Holiday Inn down there. We'd rented out the place for about 2 weeks, and they all went to their hotel rooms and changed because in the penalty phase, the judge was going to allow that. And it was shocking to me when I walked back in that courtroom how that room had changed from just what looked like ordinary citizens to almost a sea of blue. And so, again, we explained through opening statements why we thought Lance Shockley should die. And then his opening statements were why he should be allowed to live. We called a number of highway patrolmen from Colonel Stottlemyre to his first captain at Troop G, to co-workers, 2 members of the patrol that went through the academy with him and were tight and were his pallbearers. We were able to present evidence. There's a little form that each trooper fills out in case of their death, you know, how that basic arrangement who their pallbearers should be. And there's a part on there where they ask kind of if you'd like to make a statement. And Sergeant Graham, we were able to present that form. And Sergeant Graham's statement was that he'd like everybody to remember that he died doing a job he loved for the people he loved. I thought that was pretty poignant. And then obviously his family and friends all testified. And then when we were done, the defense called his grandfather and Laura Smith, the mother of his 2 children. And interestingly enough, she had testified in the first part of the trial for us. She had described Lance having that old 243 that his dad had given him, and she described also because of the timing of this murder happening and him being back home, Lance would also often brag about how it was like a challenge of his to see how fast he could get from that Van Buren area to their home out off of I think it was Road F or Highway F out there in the rural part of the county, and he would brag about that. She testified about those things. And then, like I said, in the penalty portion of the trial, I don't begrudge her at all. But she testified, and she actually asked for my permission, which she didn't need because she wanted the jury to know that her daughters loved him, and she didn't know as a parent how she would ever explain any of this to him, which goes back to one of the things we often talk about with the jury is, you know, Sergeant Graham is a victim. You know, his family are victims. The Highway Patrol is a victim of this crime. quite frankly, the state of Missouri is too, every one of us. But his family, in their way, their own little way, have also been victimized by this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're going to talk about the family here in a minute or two. But the jury came back with, I just wanted to touch on this. They came back. Can you explain how that unfolded? They came back, a majority of them were in favor of the death penalty. Or explain how that unfolded.
In Missouri, I think there are two other states in Missouri that do things this way. In Missouri, a jury is presented with three verdicts in the penalty portion of the trial. One is he deserves death, one is he deserves life, and there's a third one that is called, basically, they can't decide. And if they can't decide, a judge in Missouri, some other states don't allow this, a judge can still impose a sentence of death. But to do so, they have to make certain findings. They have to find aggravating circumstances and other things. But once they make those findings, then the judge is free to impose a sentence of death or life. And in this case, I believe from what I've heard and what I saw, that it came down to that basic fear I had when the jury decision by the defense was made not to do it in Cape, but to do it in Carter County, was that it was going to be tough to kill somebody, order their death, if you will, as that's how the defense portrays it, to someone that you somehow know distantly or know their loved ones or will run into their loved ones afterwards. And my understanding, it was 10 for death and 2 not for death. So that was our verdict, which was a little bit of, I think, a letdown for the patrol and the family. But when we came back before the judge about 6 weeks later, the judge sentenced Shockley to death.
Okay. And if I have my dates right, he was sentenced to death May 22nd of 2009.
Correct?
Here we are, April of 2025, 16 years later, 20 years from the actual death. Where is Shockley in this process as we speak today?
He's got a cot and 3 meals a day provided by a taxpayer all these years. He's still alive. I believe if things stay on course, that either late this summer or early this fall, he will actually be executed. Back to my conversation about what I would tell a family at the beginning. I typically would tell them about 2 years to get to a trial, but that it would be 12 to 15 years, the way our justice system works and drags on, before he would be executed. This case has taken a little bit longer, but we're at that point where essentially all the appeals are done. A couple weeks ago, our office, and there have been other attorneys involved in this case since the trial, that deserve tremendous credit for fighting the appeals and the habeas actions. But our office, about 2-3 weeks ago, filed a motion with the Missouri Supreme Court, now that all the other litigation appears to be done, asking to set the execution date. And there's a time frame before they will do so, which is about 30 days. But assuming that gets set, which we think will happen in April, or I mean at the end of April or early May, that the date for it would be late this summer or early fall.
Okay. And we've mentioned the family so often through our conversation today. How do you see the verdict, number one, and number two, the eventual execution of Shockley? How do you see that impacting the Graham family?
Well, and maybe I should say this, after that first meeting I had with them, I kept in touch with them obviously throughout the trial. Over the years, I have kept in touch with them. I hope they don't mind me calling them their friend, not just some guy that handled this case. And I think they feel that way too. But I hope they don't. I look upon them as good friends. Uh, and I would say, with respect to the verdict, it's what probably most families would feel, and things I talk with them about. I know there was elation. I mean, they were 4 years had finally come by. They finally had somebody point the finger at him and say, "You're guilty," and they were very, very elated. And I bet I don't know that I ever talked to them about this, but I bet they went home that night happy and woke up the next morning sad because it doesn't bring back their loved one.
Right.
And they still had more trial to go through. They now had to get up there and talk about their loved one, cry in front of strangers, which is never fun,
Right.
and then wait for that verdict. And they knew right then and there they were going to be uh, waiting for a long, long time to see our system actually give this guy what he deserves.
Yeah.
And so as I've talked to families in the past, in this family, tell them I'm sure there are going to be good days and there's going to be bad days. Sergeant Graham's anniversary of his death was recent. Members of the patrol took members of the family out to the gravesite and spent some time. Those are bad days. I'm willing to bet his birthday is a bad day. But I hope they remember the good times, and can think about not what, not necessarily how he died, but how he lived. That's the gift he was, is how he lived.
That's a great point. That's a great point. And I don't know if you want to touch on this, and if not, I understand. Through your involvement, I don't know if you'd call it a relationship, but I think you might, with Sergeant Graham's father. Could you talk, if you're comfortable, could you talk about his father a little bit in your interactions and what you think his, if it's a fair question, thought is or would have been now with an upcoming date being set for the execution?
Well, I did have the privilege of getting to know Carl Sr. Anybody that knows Carl knows he's a pretty blunt man and will say exactly what is on his mind. And he would call me over the years, and I would call him, obviously, with any updates to the case, how the appeals were going, if he just anything new. We would talk for quite a while, and he would call me just out of the blue because he wanted to, and I would hope he looked upon me also as a friend. I've gotten to know his Sergeant Graham's stepbrother these last few years a little bit better than I even knew him back then, because Carl has recently passed away, but the last couple of years he wasn't the one. He was principally my contact person, but that became Robert, his stepson. Beverly is his mother, Sergeant Graham's stepmother, but I don't think Step really belonged in that family. And Carl Sr., I mean, he wouldn't pull any punches, and he wanted to see the day when Lance was executed, and so knowing if he knew now that we were this close, I think he'd be happy, but he wouldn't be satisfied until Shockley breathes his last breath.
Understandably so. Let me ask this. When Shockley's finally executed and that day comes, is that going to end this story?
No, I wouldn't think so. I mean, I'm willing to bet I will never forget it. I will never forget the friendship I've developed with the family. I'm sure the patrol will never forget it. But I can't imagine Sergeant Graham's family ever forgetting it. It may be like a death in anyone's family where birthdays aren't as bad to deal with, but these folks have lived with this for 20 years now. And again, it's not like somebody had cancer and died. You can kind of prepare for that. It's the man went to do his job and didn't get to come home.
Right. I'm not quite sure who all's going to listen to this episode, but for those that do listen to this episode, I hope you can appreciate the sacrifice that Sergeant Graham made and that Missouri State Highway Patrol troopers make, and for that matter, all law enforcement makes on a daily basis to keep us all safe, to ensure that safety. I just wanted to mention that. And, I think I'll bring this to
And
conclusion.
Jim, if I could add,
Yeah, please do.
Their spouses and children. I mean, I'm not. My wife isn't in law enforcement. I can't imagine what I would feel like if every day she left the driveway in her highway patrol vehicle that she might not return. And worst case, get killed right out there. And the spouses, I guess, adapt somehow, but they have to live with that. And I can only imagine what the kids, at some age, it has to dawn on them about that possibility, and sometimes it's slammed down their throats by something like this happening.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm glad that you mentioned that. Let me ask this final question. Do you have any final thoughts or things you'd like to say, bringing this to conclusion?
Well, I would say this. We're in front of this wall here. There's 31 men that have given their lives on behalf of serving us citizens. And so I would hope that we could all maybe think about that they're willing to do things that most of us are not. I'm a member of an organization called the Masters, and it's about providing funds for the fallen officers' families and spouses and children when that tragedy happens. And part of their slogan is, we're not here to support you because of the job you do, although that's obvious, but we're here to support you, these men and women, because of what they're prepared to give, and that's their life. So I would end it by remembering those 31, and today, because we're talking about it, Sergeant Carl Dewayne Graham Jr., for having done that. And I would ask that everybody remember his family, because they continue to deal with these circumstances. And I would ask you to remember his highway patrol family too, because it's the middle of the day here, but somebody's out there on those streets and highways, whether the highway patrol or other law enforcement, and who knows what dangerous encounters they may be facing today. And they're doing it for people like us so we can sleep at night.
Well said. I agree wholeheartedly. Kevin, I want to sincerely thank you for talking with me today and sharing this story and sharing these details. And I want to thank you for the work that you did in securing justice for Sergeant Graham. It's such a difficult and tragic case. Your dedication to prosecuting Shockley and holding him accountable speaks volumes about your commitment to justice. And I know you would offer this, that it wasn't just you that did this, it was a collective effort by you and the men and women of your office, the men and women of the Highway Patrol, and law enforcement in general. But I think it's important to recognize an individual such as you for how serious you took this and the commitment that you had. Again, I appreciate you, Kevin, and thank you for sharing that today.
Thanks.
To my podcast followers, I would just like to mention that I think it's important that you continue to like and share and follow social media, my social media for this show, so that I can continue to bring relevant important guests like Assistant Attorney General Kevin Zoellner to the show to share the realities of law enforcement and to share true stories of what's going on out in the world today. I just wanted to mention that. Thank you for listening, and everybody stay safe.
The Right to Remain Silent podcast is brought to you by Streetwise 360 Studios. I would like to again thank today's guest for sharing the story right here on the podcast. Please remember to like, follow, share, and recommend us so that I can continue to bring you high caliber guests sharing their experiences, just like we heard today. If your law enforcement agency is interested in training provided by Streetwise 360, or if you know someone that has an interesting law enforcement story to share, please contact me via the website, www.streetwise-360.com, www.streetwise-360.com.